Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Risk Matrix with myself, Dr. Martin, and Mr. James Junkin there sporting his Mardi Gras gear.
Hey man, it's festival carnival season down on the bayou. We getting ready. Got my Mardi Gras beads.
I thought you don't go down there anymore, James.
Well, the Mardi Gras is everywhere. I just don't go down to the quarter and to the city and do it. I'm too old, man, too old. But that don't mean we can't eat king cake up here on the North Shore and catch a parade.
That's right. That's right. Well, welcome to the Risk Matrix. Here we are again, powered by VeriForce. Thank you, VeriForce, for giving us this platform to give a shout out to our followers and our viewers and VeriForce customers on topics that matter in risk and health and safety. So here we are. We're gonna do a rip for the headlines, and we're gonna follow that with some thoughts on the rip from the headlines and what that means to you. So James, recently there was an article very well liked by the health and safety community that NIOSH is rehiring workers.
NIOSH is bringing back 600 plus employees. Back last year, during some of the reductions in force and Doge activities, it was stated that, Health and Human Services intended to lay off around 90% of NIOSH's roughly 1,000 employees. Larry Sloan, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Industrial Hygiene Association, has recently announced that more than 600 NIOSH employees are coming back. That's great news.
That's great news. I'm sure that's not all of them, but it is good news because NIOSH does a lot of good things for the risk community, for the safety community, for workers in general. So let's get into some of those if you don't mind, James. Like
Absolutely.
What are these workers going to do now that they're coming back, right? Some of the things that they do work on that I think are more publicized, right, are they work in the mining community for some respiratory diseases, right? They also certify personal protective equipment. If you know, that's kind of a big push of theirs, reviewing respirators and stuff like that. And they also they monitor the 9/11 health risks. And for those of you who are listeners who are not as old as James and I, we do remember 9/11, right? Not just every year, but always. And so those are some of the key projects that were paused. But NIOSH does a whole bunch of other things. So I'll throw it to you, James. Go ahead.
One of the things I'm most thankful of for NIOSH is two things: the NIOSH Pocket Guide to chemical hazards. As someone who is routinely dealing in chemical plants in the midstream and upstream oil and gas industry, downstream oil and gas industry, looking for exposure recommendations that may equal to or be more conservative than the OSHA PL. NIOSH has always been to me a voice of reason, considering both technological and feasibility, economic feasibility in their recommendations, along with health considerations. That's one. And NIOSH did a great study a few years ago and produced this awesome video that VeriForce uses in its H2S Clear for Energy training, related to workers' serious injuries and fatalities during operations such as tank gauging. And I think that particular video was probably done more to influence folks to use engineering controls by putting in automatic tank gauging systems and stopping exposing workers to unknown quantities of chemical hazards when opening thief hatches. So I'll always be thankful for NIOSH for those activities.
So let's talk a little bit about the NIOSH guide, right? I know a lot of people know the NIOSH guide; they've seen it in written form, but there is a actual digital form that lives not only on NIOSH's website, but that you can get an app that will help you look up NIOSH RELs and stuff like that. But specifically, that NIOSH guide comes out of research, right? So NIOSH is to research as OSHA is to compliance, okay? So OSHA is the compliance grant. OSHA doesn't do studies or research or any of that kind of stuff. They just put in place regulations and etc. They do rely on some NIOSH guidelines to do that from the NIOSH research, which is, what NIOSH is tasked to do. They don't always use what NIOSH says, right? Some of the permissible exposure limits that OSHA uses are not as rigorous as the recommended exposure levels in NIOSH. Sometimes they're the same. But I think it's really important for our listeners to know that NIOSH is independent of OSHA, right? NIOSH is doing the research, they're putting out the information, they're advising or supporting the compliance branch, but they do work separately. So it's really kind of important that NIOSH does the work that they do, right? Because they're the ones going out and doing health surveillance studies. They're looking at different chemicals. So, I don't know if people know that distinction, but it's really good to know that distinction, right? They do a lot of safety research and training.
I like to refer to as NIOSH as the scientist of safety. And I caution companies sometimes, they always say, we want to go with the most restrictive standard. We want to go with the most restrictive standard. Be careful when you're talking that when we're dealing with chemical exposures, because the American Conference of Industrial Hygienists also puts out exposure limits, and they don't consider economic feasibility. So if you take something like H2S, for example, where in general industry standard, OSHA's silent in 1910-1000 Z Table 2 as to the permissible exposure limit. It's 10 parts per million in the construction standard. NIOSH's recommended exposure limit is 10 parts per million, but ACGIH is 1 parts per million. So using that as an example, if I say I'm going with the most restrictive standard and you go to 1 parts per million, that means if you have any potential for exposure and you're at 1 part per million, you would have to literally put people under air just to get out of the truck on an oil and gas production location. And that's not feasible, right? So NIOSH really is a voice of reason when it comes to chemical exposure hazards. They have the latest data. It's hard to change OSHA standards. I remember the fight for silica. I mean, how long have we known that silica causes silicosis? I can remember a video of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Marion Martin, one of the first secretaries of labor, put out warnings on silica. A very long Department of Labor black and white silica movie, right? And that was back in the day, right? And I've used that in training.
I don't even know if they had sound on the videos back in the day. I know it was black and white. They had sound. It was black and white. I mean, we're talking about Charlie Chaplin days. This is early 1900s. Couldn't be more. I know it was pre-World War II.
Okay, well, I'm just telling you, it probably was 1930s, but it was black and white. It mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt and Marion Martin. So, we've known about silica a long time. One of the topics that NIOSH looks at is silica and other exposures, right? So
and that's kind of my point there. To come back to that, is we knew about that then. It took all the way to 2014 for OSHA to get a standard that adequately protects workers. Yep. So I don't want to ding OSHA. OSHA plays a very important enforcement role, but I say this to my students all the time. If you think OSHA regulations are made by the great safety professionals that are in Washington, D.C., you're mistaken. They're made by lawyers, lobbyists, and the government. What you can get past. NIOSH doesn't have to deal with bureaucracy like that. NIOSH is coming from a scientific basis, and certainly we learn things over time about how chemical exposures affect people's bodies. And I'm very thankful for NIOSH, and I'm not an industrial hygienist. You are. I'm not smart enough to be an industrial hygienist. They're the scientists of safety, but I'm very thankful for NIOSH and glad to see that they're back at work.
So let's move on. There's some other things here that I've got on my list, right? I did talk a little bit about this at the top of the show, right? Health surveillance, they are resuming studies on respiratory illnesses like black lung in minors and cancer risks in high risk occupations, right? So some of the really in-depth studies on things like benzene and some of those other listed carcinogens have come from NIOSH, right? And if it's on the list, they're studying it. They also are looking at carcinogenic risks to firefighters, right? Which has been a long time coming. When you burn things or you burn an amalgamation of things and you're in those fires for long periods of time, you do get exposure to a bunch of things. And so they have looked at that. And again, I'll mention the 9/11 risks from when the Twin Towers fell.
Well, I know, speaking about firefighter exposures, when I was in the Navy, we used to use halon. No one really knew what halon was doing to people. I'm pretty sure continued exposure to AFFF foam's probably not good
I
for
was going to
you.
say the foams are a big push for how they've affected firefighters' health.
The burn pits that you experience for our brethren that were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even back to the Gulf War, I can remember when I was in the Navy, burn pits during that time frame. NIOSH is able to give the data necessary to support claims. You mentioned black lung, and black lung's been around a long time, and it jogged some memories. My great grandfather, who I knew, World War I veteran, worked in the coal mines up around Birmingham, the Pittsburgh of the South, and he passed away of black lung. He was diagnosed with black lung, and my great grandmother lived off a pension that was set aside for miners that were exposed to black lung. None of that happens without agencies such as NIOSH conducting research, and hopefully, we prevent exposures where workers don't have to suffer through debilitating respiratory illnesses.
Yeah. So I'm gonna circle back there because you mentioned something that I have firsthand knowledge of. You talked about Iraq and Afghanistan and burn pits there, but little known fact, a lot of the major military bases. I've worked on some of the closures of military bases in my environmental days, and it is, or it was, a practice of the U.S. military when they were done with something, they dig a pit, push it in, light it on fire, right? And so, I worked on a major air base out here on the East Coast. It's now an industrial park, and one in Massachusetts that's the same. And a lot of the contamination that came out of these parks, tanks of oils and stuff aside, right, and jet fuel, there were a lot of burn pits, and that's just that was way back in the 40s, 50s, 30s when the military was getting rid of stuff. You just ammunition, everything, just put it in a pit and light it on fire, right? So we're looking at a lot of military service members that have been exposed to those types of things, and so research in this area is a really good idea, especially when it comes to a mix of chemicals and exposures, right? So
I want to point out too, things escape your fence line. In the chemical industry, we always say defend the fence line. You have some modicum of control inside the fence. Outside the fence, it gets in the general public, you've lost all control, right? Well, when you have burn pits or chemical releases and it gets beyond your fence line, certainly big burn pits of smoke, right? They're usually communities next to military bases. People live there. People support the base. People work on the base as civilians. Folks that are service people on their duty. Sometimes there's not barracks necessary for housing on base, and you'll have off-base housing, particularly if you're married and have dependents. So there's exposures there as well. I don't want to sidetrack our podcast here and getting into military exposure to burn pits, but that's interested me because when we came back from the war, we don't talk about this much anymore. When we came back from the Gulf War syndrome was a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody
and there's been a lot of research done on it now.
What caused it, and now Gulf War syndrome is a recognized illness that is compensable from a disability standpoint by the VA. And it took many, many years to get that, just like the Vietnam veterans took many, 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 many years of government denials of exposures to Agent Orange.
So yeah, I mean, I could sidetrack this discussion all day. Worked on another big military installation where pyrotechnics were used, and as you know, when you shoot things into the sky, uh, things go with the wind patterns, and we see that. So we can talk about that another day, right? But we'll go down that road. They do important research when it comes to chemicals, mixes of chemicals, fires and chemicals, etc., and protects our firefighters and co-workers and a bunch of other people. So what else do they do? Fatality assessments, right? One of the big things that lives on their websites are these face reports. They talk about the responses to fatalities, what caused them, what things could have been different that would have prevented them. These are called face reports, and there's some pretty neat ones up there. In fact, on a case I was working on, there was one that actually mirrored a case. So these are reference points for people who do expert witness things, or who are looking for what have people done in other situations.
I was just checking out the NIOSH website, all the things that they have beyond just the research training.
Training
that
is a
on your
big one.
list?
They actually have training PowerPoints. They have training courses. I know I've been on there through the CDC, and they present a lot of healthcare worker things. They did a lot around our COVID pandemic. So these are things they certify respirators for public use, and talk about the efficacy of filtering face piece respirators and whatnot. So what else you seeing on there, James?
Um, you mentioned healthcare, and it's kind of timely. I've got a student right now who's a nurse making transition into safety, and we were talking about workplace violence enforcement under the general duty clause for nurses in healthcare. And I see that NIOSH has on its website training that says workplace violence prevention for nurses training. And I found that to be something very useful. As a safety professional, if they ask me to develop workplace violence training, I've got a general idea about workplace violence training, but I'm not an expert of how that applies in a particular healthcare setting. So that's a tool in your toolbox that you could use if you're a nurse or if you're in the healthcare field where you need to put something in place related to training when it comes to workplace violence. If you're in California or some of the other states that have workplace violence prevention plans, the NIOSH website would be a good place to go to get training resources to meet the standards related to the state plan obligations for workplace violence.
Well, let me just give a little plug for filling out your training. Right, I've used this before when I've been making PowerPoints or training things from my clients, and they even have an A to Z table of contents for people looking for stuff. Right, starting in the A's, about NIOSH. Right, that's number one. But absences in the workplace, adult blood lead epidemiology, aerial lift safety, aerosols. So they're looking at all kinds of hazards. And there are pages and pages on different topics, right? Occupational cancer, cannabis in the workplace. I mean, you could scroll on this forever. If you're looking for something, this is a way to go. And James and I talk a lot, for our listeners. We talk a lot about where do you go for information, um, not only if you're trying to study something or learn about something or flesh out your professional competencies. If you're creating training or advising clients, this is a great place to go and see if they have something or some research on what you're doing or what you want to discuss with your client.
Here's a great one right now that's very timely. I know our listeners are hear this after our filming, but right now we're in the midst of a major winter storm that's affecting just about everybody except the folks on the West Coast, um, Northeast, Southeast. Um, Training resources related to cold weather stress, protecting workers from the cold. And cold in Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee. That's a different thing than cold in North Dakota, primarily due to worker acclimatization and the resources that we have. So that I'm just looking here. There's training materials, there's research, there's different videos that you can utilize to help your team implement the necessary program. So if you're a safety professional and you're looking to put together a comprehensive safety program around certain topics and you don't know where to go for resources that are trusted, you can trust NIOSH when it comes to their training.
Right. Right. So I'm looking on their blog right now, and they've done a lot of things that we just talked about. One of the things that I highlight, because it came up in one of my travels as a consultant, to hazardous drugs in healthcare settings. We talk about exposure, and the nurse that you talked about, or nurses, healthcare workers, right? They're administering drugs to patients, and there are actual hazards associated with administering these drugs. Not only taking the drugs, right? Because a lot of these, for cancer and whatnot, they're supposed to be toxic to the cancer cells, etc. But they also pose a risk to healthcare workers. So that's something that was new to me, and I went to NIOSH to find that out. So a lot of stuff on here. I encourage you to go to the cdc.gov website /NIOSH, right? And you can go on there, find a bunch of different resources for things that you wouldn't otherwise, think that NIOSH has. So they don't just do research on health hazards, they do research on physical hazards too, right? We've got worker safety, driver safety, vehicle safety, nail gun safety. I mean, these are some of the ones that I just kind of noticed as I was scrolling through.
Well, and I think probably one of the most important things NIOSH does is to certify Respirator. In the global marketplace now, there are a tremendous amount of counterfeits. We saw that a lot during COVID, but even before COVID, some of the materials that were coming out of China had fake NIOSH certifications on there. Is pretty obvious. NIOSH, when they catch that, they post it on their website. You can go and verify the vendors that you're purchasing from NIOSH. So make sure that that's a tool that you can utilize if you're using air purifying respirators in the workplace, that respirator has the proper certification.
Okay, let me just tag on to that, right? They just put out in September of 2025, before they were all kind of let go, Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Respiratory Protection Handbook, revised September 2025. So that's on there as well.
Absolutely.
So
So
cool.
welcome back, NIOSH. We missed you.
Back.
We missed you. We're
Looking
glad
forward
you're
to some
back.
good things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So James, if people are looking to get in touch with us or be on the show as a guest, we need some guests.
Hey, we always need guests. We put out a LinkedIn post. We got some response for that. But hey, the Risk Matrix podcast, listen to me. The Risk Matrix podcast has its own page on LinkedIn. It's standing up. We already got like almost 500 followers there, but we need more. Between Dr. Martin and myself, we have over 50,000 followers on LinkedIn. We need some of you that follow us on LinkedIn to come on over and follow us there on the Risk Matrix podcast. That's where you can get notifications of episodes, articles that Dr. Martin and I are publishing. Sometimes end up make their way over to the Risk Matrix podcast page. Interesting poll questions. Hey, interact with us individually, but also through that page. We greatly appreciate every one of you that follows us, that interacts with us, that likes our page, that comments. We do this for you to engage the community, to provide some resources for you so that you can help bring workers home safe from high hazard jobs. So this is my challenge. Sometimes I forget. If you had fun today listening to our podcast, you must like and subscribe. If you learned something new today that you did not already know, you must like and subscribe. You must do it. It's like a law or something.
Yep.
What you think
So
about that? Roll Tide?
I like that. I like the law. I like us laying down our own laws. So thanks a lot, everybody, for listening. Like and subscribe. Follow us on Spotify, anywhere that you get podcasts. You can even tell Amazon's Alexa to go ahead and play us if you're walking around the house and you need something to listen to while you're doing your chores. Please do that. We thank you for everything you do for us to keep us on the air. And if you got something we want to talk about, let us know. And
Let us know.
thanks for everything. And I just want you to remember, it just depends.
It does just depend. But y'all, it's forever more cold outside. So for all of you enduring the cold this winter, stay warm. Until next time, keep bringing those workers home safe from high hazard jobs. Roll Tide.
Tide.
Out, baby.